My name is Tay Moss. I'm the coordinator of the Innovative Ministry Center at the Toronto United Church Council. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick and very dirty overview of the digital world of social media as it relates to church. I'm going to suggest some helpful categories to break it down, and then I'm going to talk about how Christians ought to engage this new place, given what we know about how God brings people to God's self. I'll propose some key questions to consider to shape the style of your presence, and I'll wrap up with some suggested next steps for your community. By the end of our time, I hope that you'll be inspired to extend your church's digital presence with renewed confidence in the church's mission and a useful perspective on what it looks like in the digital world. Thank you for joining me. Please like and subscribe to the TUCC channel to see more videos like this. A few qualifiers. I'm speaking from a place of privilege as a white male American middle-class Anglican priest with 17 years of experience. I live on land which has been the home of many peoples, including the Anishinaabe First Nations, with whom the settler peoples of Canada have several treaties, including the Dish with One Spoon and the Treaty of the Toronto Purchase. We give thanks to God for the opportunity to share this land and to have this time together, weird as it has been this season. So congratulations, you made it. Your church survived the radical pivot from in-person gathering to something else, a newish way of being together that can be broadly called social media church. For many churches, it may have been like jumping off a cliff into deep waters. But as new as things like online worship and Zoom-based Bible studies might feel, the truth is that the church, my church, your church, all the churches, have been online in one form or another for some time now. You see, even churches that did not intentionally cultivate an online presence pre-COVID-19 were nonetheless represented in the virtual space every time someone shared anything about them. For example, pictures from Easter morning services, or Googled you looking for your location on Google Maps. In fact, if you simply Google the name of your church, you'll probably find lots of instances in which it existed in the online world even before you had a website. Most of our churches have probably been reviewed and discussed and indexed in the social media sphere, but this current time of COVID has forced churches to reckon with that reality even more bluntly. As we contemplate the future, we appear to be at an inflection point for church and social media. Given that most of us now have made that pivot to have an online intentional platform and are beginning to gather an audience and some energy and some time to invest in it, what we ought to do with it. What we're talking about is moving beyond emergency measures to some strategic and God-inspired mission. How to continue to do God's mission in this strange new land. Where are we exactly? And what should we look for tools to navigate? Let's begin with this premise. The digital world is another mission field. Mission is simply our attempt to faithfully execute God's call to us to further the kingdom of God by following Jesus Christ and teaching others to do the same. It's being faithful to the instruction of Jesus to, quote, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." Furthermore, I'd say that it's fair to say that the church doesn't have a mission, but rather that God's mission has a church. The church, in fact, is God's mission strategy. So what's ours? The advantage of using this framework of mission is that we already have tools in that toolkit, and the first of these is simply holy curiosity. A spirit of discovery is a great place to start. We engage this new land as having a geography and a language which we can learn and discover together. Thus, the task of doing mission in the online world first requires an appreciative observation of the place and its inhabitants. For example, if we were preparing to start a new church plant in a brand new suburb development, we would be first asking questions about the people who would live there and what their lifestyles might be like. Is this a development for newly retired first-generation immigrants whose first language is Mandarin? Or is this a place attracting working-class, English-speaking white people with young kids? All these considerations are possible. So let's look around this digital land. Social media is a deliberately vague term for this talk that covers basically any gesture of connection, any artifact of communication. Email, for example, is a form of social media, and social media has been around for a long time. We could even use the term to describe the vinyl records of famous preachers that were passed from house to house in the early 1900s. That was a form of church and social media. But generally speaking today, we're talking about the kinds of digital communications that made communication between people relatively cheap and easy, thanks to the rise of the internet. We've gone from an industrial age to an information age to a network age. And you don't even need a thinker like Marshall McLuhan to point out that although we might shape these tools, the tools will also shape us. So mapping the kinds of connections made in the network age brings a helpful precision and insight to an otherwise messy tangle of wires and interconnections. So here are a few of the broad categories arranged in the chronological order in which they gained prominence. When the World Wide Web was first developed, it was modeled on a print publishing paradigm, where static pages were linked together in a web built on links. Back then, they didn't even have search engines, just links from one document to another. There was also email and Usenet groups. The first language of the internet was a word processing language called HTML. Web 1.0, as it's called, was built around relatively static pages delivered from centralized servers, along with a crude virtual mail system and message forum system. One of the first important evolutions was when people started adding personal content to pages as time-stamped entries, like a log, thus developed the blog format of social content. The next step was the emergence of two phenomena nearly simultaneously: microblogging and social networks. Microblogging was a way for people to share small snapshots of their life. Think of Twitter and Instagram. Suddenly, people were taking pictures of their dinner and posting it online. Why? Possibly because it increased and extended their pleasure in the experience. For example, a few months ago, I shot a little time lapse of making pizza at home from scratch. For several days, and even a week or two after I made that post, I would get a little rush of pleasure, a micro-affirmation, whenever someone liked that post. It reminded me of a meal and extended the pleasure that I derive from it. Social networks took that instinct to share our lives with each other and gave it more structure. Now, instead of sharing a witty thought or a picture of dinner with the whole world, we are organized into clusters and groups. I post a picture of my kid, and I know that only my family or close friends will see it. My work associates or random strangers will not. Thus, my post has been given a new kind of context thanks to the social media network. One of the most interesting recent developments has been the rise of a new creator culture of patronage. Once upon a time, expensive to produce television was supported by ad revenue. But increasingly in the online world, you have content creators being supported directly by their fans. For example, there's a YouTube channel about space and rockets that I really like called Everyday Astronaut. Thanks to a website called Patreon, I can voluntarily tip that creator $2 for every video he makes. Enough people do that he's been able to quit his previous job and focus solely on making videos about rockets in space. Not only that, but over time, he's been able to upgrade to the absolute best cameras and production equipment available to make his content. And that patron-artist relationship works both ways. Because I am a patron, I know that he's going to respond to a message if I send him one, and I have special access to content that he's making and can suggest show ideas. It's now possible to make a living making digital content about things you love and selling that directly to your audience. This could have important implications for how the church is supported financially in the future, but for now we're going to move on to understand more about the geography of the online world. What I described before was a quick and dirty historical view of the social media form of publishing. That is, we were looking at writing, who's writing, why are they writing, whom are they writing for. But another perspective to take would be the 50,000-foot overview and attempt to describe the communities we see below us. All the developments I mentioned before gave rise to distinct online communities with their own dialects, customs, myths, and heroes. Thinking about the online world as a space which we inhabit with tribes and nations helps us get a sense of an impossibly vast ecosystem. For example, we might start to group people into continents according to language. English land is very big, of course, but so is Mandarin land, and there isn't a lot of overlap between those two. These continents can feature peninsulas like Western Christianity or sports fans. Both of these still have lots of connection to the motherland of mainline culture. And the people and ideas can flow freely back and forth between them. But we start to see some separateness once people move out to inhabit these subcultures. Islands, in this analogy, are more isolated and feature greater boundaries to enter. For example, there are 78.3 million people who play the game Fortnite. The median number of hours per week per player is 6 to 10 hours per week. That's huge. But how much can we say that the Fortnite game has influenced mainline culture? Not much, really. The hardest borders to cross on this map would be created by language and technology. For example, I have no idea what QQ, the Chinese social network, is like, nor have I had time to figure out how to engage TikTok. So right there, I've been excluded from two huge communities. But by and large, most users tend to stake out property in just a few of these online places. Maybe they have a very active Facebook presence, which they update daily, and an Instagram account, which gets attention once a week, and then a message board about wood carving that they go to when they have a new project to share or a question to ask. But all is not perfect in the land of the internet. Trolls and malcontents roam the land and make trouble, often for trouble's sake. You can pretty much guarantee, for example, that if you mention certain topics like the ordination of women, you're going to get some trolls to engage and attack you. As we look broadly at the online community, we can begin to discern certain patterns of information flows at the micro and macro level that can help inform our decisions about nurturing online community. For example, when we say a post goes viral, we should understand that there is an intentional mechanism for that. We should also note that networks have nodes, points of connection that have outside influence on the network, what the network perceives. Practically speaking, you should know who is the biggest influencer in your analog congregation, so how about your digital one? And it's not just who posts the most, but whose posts get the most engagement with shares, likes, and comments. At the end of the day, humans online will still behave like humans, so whatever motivations and personality quirks might exist in real life are more or less replicated online. But here are some ways in which the online presence differs from the physical world. First, identity has left the body. That is, the crucial aspect of our human person, our identity, is no longer constrained by our physical presence. It lives on the cloud and is subject to the dangers of theft and cancellation and the opportunities of popularity and influencing. Think of like the phenomenon of identity theft and cancel culture. Those things didn't exist until identity as a social construct moved to the online space. A distinct feature of online identity is that we are represented both persistently and in a sticky manner. Persistent because our representations are always available for people to engage. Think of how someone can engage us on our Facebook profile even as we sleep. They're sticky because they cannot easily be expunged or reset. Your digital history, everything you have ever done and said online, is easily accessible through powerful search algorithms. Second, our online presence can exist in multiple places simultaneously. Most of us maintain multiple existences across different online communities. And I don't just mean an online platform like Twitter or Facebook, but even different communities within those platforms. For example, I'm represented on Twitter as being part of the Weird Anglicans of Twitter group. That's just a loose association of Anglicans who post things online at the intersection of culture and church. It's not a formal group, just something that we call ourselves when we use the hashtag WAT. I also moderate a private group on Facebook for the clergy of the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. That's a more formal association that requires approval to join. And I'm represented in both places all the time. I have a polypresence. Another distinct feature of online presence is the monetization of attention. There is a famous saying that if you aren't paying for the product, you are the product. Specifically, the companies like Facebook and YouTube are selling your attention to advertisers. That means that ad-friendly, revenue-generating content is always going to be privileged by that system. And that's just one effect of the monetization of attention. Another is that people now have access to vast seas of excellent content. So the bar has been set very high if you intend to create content that will engage a general audience. Alternatively, and this is the fourth thing to notice about online presence, is that we've seen a rise in niche and fetish subcultures on the net. So no matter what obscure, random thing you're into, you can find hundreds, if not thousands, of fellow fans. For example, There was a TV show in the 1980s called Tales of the Golden Monkey. It was a derivative of the whole Indiana Jones motif of family-friendly adventure in exotic places. I loved it as a kid. And when I looked it up as an adult, I found there were a bunch of web pages and online discussion forums for fans just like me. And if I wanted to, I could spend hours every day engaging in that community by responding to fan theories, reflecting on favorite moments, or even creating original fan art inspired by the characters and plots of the show. You can get your nerd on with any obsession you care to name. The dark side of this is that every possible fetish or false idol or conspiracy theory has been encouraged and reinforced by insular groups. I'm sure that we would not see the problematic movements like militant white nationalism have the kind of power and influence they have if it weren't for the connectivity of a network society. Fifth is a phenomenon I refer to as the relentless churn of the infinite scroll. Have you ever found yourself in an unbreakable loop checking Facebook, Twitter, email, your favorite website, Instagram, TikTok, back to Facebook, and around again? Or have you just gotten down the rabbit hole of Wikipedia where you look up something and then you see a linked article and you look that up and then you go down and down and down? These websites and applications are designed to hook you in this way. Relentless novelty, the micro rewards that come from brain stimulation, and small dopamine hits, all this create a cycle of engagement that can be extremely shallow. The success of Twitter and TikTok is built on the backbone of deliberately restricting content to very, very, very short hot takes and memes, and just tiny little hits of newness. And that push to post, to keep our voices heard and our message at the top of the scroll, keep our presence current and relevant, it's relentless. Sixth, if you look at this map made by XKCD, you can see that the whole culture of the internet could be divided up into a geographic analog. The different internet communities are drawn with sizes proportional to their user base, and it can be very helpful to think in these terms, spaces that we occupy. But another aspect is what some writers have called the flows, which are the structures and dynamics that unfold in time. Think of it like the wind that blows across these continents and islands. Like popular memes or important world events, they're introduced into the atmosphere and flow across these social landscapes. Or perhaps they just swirl around within one region. Churches can choose to participate in these flows, to fly a kite as it were, by creating content specific to that flow. Or not. They can maintain a perspective that asks, what are the flows that are going by our church's online presence? And doing so can open our eyes to further methods and modes of effective evangelism. Seventh, I want to say that as overwhelming as all of these considerations might appear, we're not alone in feeling that way. Everyone who participates in the digital world, even the so-called digital natives who have known nothing else, feel to some extent like visitors to a house they themselves do not own. Nobody owns this space, and we all feel like we're traveling through it like pilgrims in search of the things that human beings have always searched for, meaning and love. Which brings me to my next point. Humans have always been searching for meaning and love. And in my humble opinion, the church has always been an imperfect provider of both. We've been in the business for more than 2,000 years and have seen massive social change before. The church not only survived the fall of the Roman Empire, it went on to dominate Europe and beyond. The Enlightenment, the Age of Exploration, colonization, the Industrial Revolution, the Information Age, etc., have all seen massive corresponding shifts in the church. What has changed is not only self-perception or theologies or practices, but also the whole mission strategy of the church. That is, how do we do the work in the world that God has called us to do, to preach the good news and welcome and teach those who would follow the way of Jesus? To do this, we use the E word, evangelism. So we might observe, looking at a grand sweep of the history of the church, that its engagement with host cultures has revealed several nearly universal truths. First, that it's relationship that matters. Attempting to reduce the Christian faith merely to propositional matters by boiling down over the harsh flame of rationalism is going to make a really dry and terrible thing. Christian faith is not just about believing the right thing, as though it was cosmic fire insurance against accidental damnation. Nor is belief a free ticket into heaven. Grace is costly, because we have to spend ourselves to gain ourselves. The way of the cross is a way of sacrificial love, and that means that evangelism must be a social, relational activity. Second, the price of creating relationship is intimacy, and that intimacy requires self-disclosure, that is, stories. It's stories about God, encoded in the Bible among other places, and about ourselves that will bring people into relationship with God, us, and the body of Jesus, which is the church. Third, when we think about faith as a relationship, we might notice that it falls into the same pathways and patterns that all relationships do. There's an introduction, a courtship phase, and so forth. And many writers from the patristic age into our own have laid out typical patterns by which people come to faith, and these same patterns repeat in the digital space. Fourth, it's important to note that there are multiple such pathways. There's not one true way to faith. For example, one scheme is to say that Christians come to believe, belong, and behave, but not necessarily in that order. Someone might come to the church with service in their heart, and therefore behave as a Christian might, with love of neighbor, before they come to feel like they belong to a fellowship of saints, which is also before they come to believe in the right doctrines about the church and about God. Yet another person might enter the fellowship of belonging before other aspects of the full Christian faith take root. The implication of this is that our churches need more than one entry path into community. You need to respond to diversity of the world with a bit of your own diversity. Here are a few dialectical poles that you might think about when cultivating the style of your church's online presence. These are not binary choices, but rather ends of a spectrum. And none of them are bad, but they are style questions that will impact the substance of your church's message. For example, to what degree is the online experience you're creating similar to the in-real-life experience people might have visiting your church? Or to what degree are you taking advantage of the unique attributes of the online world to create something new? Is there a high degree of continuity with past experience, or are you doing innovative and potentially disruptive things? This is also related to whether you privilege the bright, shiny things that a new platform might offer you, or whether your focus is on community cohesion and you ignore the features of the new world. Another question to consider, dialectically, is how much space you're giving for people to insert themselves into the church's online story. For example, in worship, can they chime in with prayer requests live? Some churches have built their communities on simultaneously experiencing an inspiring form of worship. They have paid choirs and excellent architecture that may be best served by a pre-recorded and carefully produced YouTube video of worship. At the other end of the spectrum are churches which have privileged participation and whose best choice will be a Zoom service. The vulnerability versus transcendence dialectic is about how you or your church represent your reality. Are you creating an aspirational vision of what church, community, God could be like? Or are you reflecting people's lived experience back at them? Like, to look at a lot of Instagram accounts, you would think that we all eat incredibly beautiful food with perfectly clean children on sunset-lit beaches every day. Yet, you want people to relate to you rather than to aspire to be you, then perhaps you ought to moderate all that perfection with some notes of real life. The last dialectic, event versus environment, is an important consideration because it goes to how you give freedom to your audience to experience your message in their own way. Are you building a space which people inhabit and explore in a nonlinear way, or are you calling them to experience the same thing together at the same time? Taking a look at the cartoon to the right about how the background for a clergy study, you can see how the choice of a background on Zoom or on a video call is a non-trivial matter when it comes to representing your church's proclamation. Do you want the pastor's message to be framed by the charming vulnerability of a messy desk, or the transcendent purity of a white wall with a single well-lit icon? So as you think about your own church and how it does online worship now, you might ask, what's more important to you? Participation of as many people as possible, or the presentation of a meaningful and consistent and polished message? Another question to consider: do you think your community's social media presence accurately reflects its values and its culture? Now, it's easy to get caught up in technical considerations, such as how many technically gifted volunteers do I need to do a good live stream, or how expensive is the equipment? It's also easy to just start focusing on the production calendar and trying to sustain a post of posting weekly worship videos or daily reflections or whatever. But at the end of the day, we cannot lose focus on the fact that the ministry is still all about creating and nurturing authentic relationships. That's true if you're talking about a ministry happening at a brick and mortar church, but it's also true if you're talking about virtual presence in cyberspace. A few final notes. The old normal is dead. Long live the new normal. Even when vaccines for COVID are available to everyone and the limitations on gathering have been lifted, we're still going to have many people who prefer online worship, online fellowship, and even online service to others. It's also worth noting that the ecology and political instability we have come to know is unlikely to diminish in our lifetimes, that we're going to see more and more man-made and natural disasters. Global weirding is a thing, and we should adapt to that circumstance. Next, patterns established now will have long tails into the future, so careful consideration and design are called for. I would say that the best way to do this is to take an honest look at your church's authentic self and craft patterns of engagement with your surrounding community that match. The best way to understand your community's authentic self is to tell stories. Not stories about who you want to be, but stories about what you've done, who you are now. Ask questions like, what's the most amazing thing our church has done in its history? Or what are we most proud of? Questions like that will reveal the strengths and values that your church has as an incarnated community of Christ. You may also notice right now that you're doing things which bring life to your church community. What are they? And how can they be continued in the post-COVID time? Lastly, I just want to say that the church is not ours to save. God already did that. The church will persist in the world until the end. God will always find a way. What's at stake is not whether the church will flourish in the online world, but rather what's at stake is whether our church, your church, my church, will flourish as an authentic incarnation of Christ in the digital world. And that is something that we very much have control over. Can you be faithful to the calling of God to go to all nations, even the nations of cyberspace, to preach, to heal, and to baptize? I certainly hope so. Thank you for joining me in this brief overview. Check out our website, innovativeministry.ca, to learn more about how our organization can equip yours for future church mission in the world. I pray that God will continue to bless your ministries. Thank you very much.